and I believe I read in your book where the Reverend Jerry Falwell didn't preach his first sermon against abortion until 1978. Was there some type of revelation, if I'm speaking in evangelical terminology, from God? Was there a prophetic word that came forward that said, you're missing this, you're out of bounds, get back in bounds? What happened?
It's a really good question. What happens is that this Paul Weyrich, the guy that we talked about earlier, in advance of the 1978 midterm elections. Now, again, let's remember Weyrich is this political organizer. Weyrich went to the head of the Republican National Committee, at that time, a man by the name of Bill Brock, who had a former Republican senator from Tennessee. And Weyrich asked Brock for some money to organize white evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at him, at Weyrich, and said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going to give you money. Who are these people? I don't think this is a legitimate use for our money." Whereupon Weyrich, again according to his own account, resolved to go out and elect some improbable people to the Senate in the 1978 midterm elections. He focuses on 4 Senate races. One is in New Hampshire, where the Democrat Thomas McIntyre was running for re-election. One is in Iowa, where the Democrat Dick Clark was running for re-election. And then 2 Senate races in Minnesota. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who, of course, was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And what happens in those Senate races, first of all, going into the election day, all of the polls, all the pundits said that these Democratic nominees or candidates were going to win easily. And what happens is that on the Sunday before the midterm election in 1978, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, because this is a Catholic issue until that time, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, which tends to be the case with midterm elections, all 4 of the favored Democratic candidates lost to anti-abortion Republicans. Now, wow. I remember going through Paul Weyrich's papers, which are, oddly enough, at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and coming across his correspondence surrounding that midterm election of 1978. And it's almost like the papers start to sizzle because he realizes that he's finally found an issue that might engage grassroots white evangelicals. None of these other issues were working.
Now, sorry to chime in, but when you say engage, I want to go back to the historical picture that you painted before. Right. Once engaged, now on the sidelines, right? But now here's the possibility for them to re-engage.
But right. We missed a step here. And let's get
all the steps in.
This is my fault. We talked about the abortion myth. The fiction that evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade is simply not true. And again, I don't want to bore your listeners or you.
This is very important.
Going through all the issues, but I can say without fear of contradiction, abortion was not the catalyst for evangelical political activism in the 1970s.
Okay. Then what was? Let's get to the what.
And this is where we get into your territory. Yes. That is court decisions and legal actions. The real catalyst was not Roe v. Wade. It was another court decision in a decision that was handed down on June 30th, 1971, in a case called Green v. Connolly. Now, I am going to get into the weeds a little bit here because I think it's probably important. Yes. The background for Green v. Connolly was Holmes County, Mississippi, and the issue of desegregation of the public schools. The first year of desegregation in Holmes County, Mississippi, the number of white students in the public school system dropped from over 700, I think it was the number that keeps coming in my mind was 771. Don't quote me on that number, but it's over 700. Over 700 white students in the public schools. The first year of publication of desegregation, that number of white students drops to 28. The second year of desegregation, that number drops to 0.
So where do these children go?
At the same time, 3 segregation academies, church-sponsored, let's remember.
And we're talking about God-fearing, love Jesus, want to save the world.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All white schools apply to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status.
Right.
And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi say, this isn't right. And so they file suit to block the tax exemption of these segregation academies. Now, again, I would defer to you about the whole legal history of this, but it gets that suit gets tied up with another suit. It works its way through the court systems, and it goes finally to the district court for the District of Columbia in a case called Green v. Connolly. Connolly was for John Connolly, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and for that reason, head of the Internal Revenue Service.
Right.
And on June 30th, 1971, the district court for the District of Columbia issued a ruling that said that, in effect, any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution, and therefore it has no claims on tax-exempt status.
And that's a blockbuster decision.
That's
Why?
a blockbuster decision.
Tell us why that was blockbuster.
Well, what happens then is that, well, first of all, Richard Nixon, who's president at the time, issues a directive to the Internal Revenue Service saying, don't issue tax exemptions to any segregation academies. So it's Nixon really behind it. And then what happens over the course of the 1970s is that the Internal Revenue Service seeks to enforce that decision. And as they do so, they begin to challenge the tax exemption of places like Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, but also other segregation academies. And guess who runs one of those segregation academies? It's called Lynchburg Christian Academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, founded in 1967 by Jerry Falwell.
The Reverend Jerry Falwell.
The Reverend Dr. Jerry Falwell.
Of the moral majority.
And that gets his attention. The IRS is coming after my tax exemption. And that, according to Paul Weyrich, as well as dozens of other sources, that was the catalyst for the religious right. It was not Roe v. Wade. So it was a court decision, but it wasn't Roe v. Wade. It was Green v. Connolly.